What we're going to do today and then on Tuesday is talk about personhood. So, I'm pulling this person at this ground zero from the article that you were to read was attached to the quiz. Now it's just a reading verification quiz. But this is essential, right? So it's hard to do ethics if we don't know exactly what it is that we're talking about, especially if we're going to do medical ethics or bioethics about the human person. Well, we need to know something about this human person. So we're going to look at some terms today. We're going to look at the terms life, we're going to look at the terms human, and we're also going to look at the terms person. So let me just ask you a general question. There's something in the next room, and you don't know what it is, but I would like your permission. Can I go over and destroy it? Being is whatever exists, an existent thing. So there's some being in the next room, and I would like to go over and destroy it. What say you? Why would you say no? It's a cardboard box.
It's not yours, I guess.
Okay. All right. You're pretty good. Now I've got to reframe my question, right? So, nobody except you has would have any authority to tell me to do it or not do it, and I'm asking you why. So let's say that it is mine. Can I go over there and destroy it? You're okay with that? You don't mind if I go over there and destroy my monkey? I can go kill my monkey?
It's your monkey.
Would you ask what it is? What if I tell you it was my baby? Would you still say that? You're struggling? Okay. We have to ask what a thing is, right? That's like known, at least in philosophy of ontology. It's not good enough for us to not know what it is or say this is what it's not. So if I were to go over there and if I were to say I'm going to go over there and destroy this thing, and eventually you say, well, what is it? Well, it's a spider. You may not have an issue, especially if I tell you it's on its way over here and you don't like spiders. But if I did tell you that it was a cute little bunny rabbit, you'd probably be thinking, oh my God, why are you going over to do that, right? It always starts in that. We have to ask what a thing is. And what happens in courses like this is that I should almost like, force you into starting at a different foundation. Most of the times in ethics, like when I teach nursing ethics, not all the time, but often, we'll go through different ethical systems. This is deontology. This is virtue ethics. This is, let's say, utilitarianism. And then when we go to apply it, sometimes students just tell me, like, they go back to the default position, like, well, here's what I think. And it gets to be inconsistent, right? So we often develop, like, what we call an intuition, but we don't realize that we're being influenced by some level of culture and family or whatever, and it can leave us inconsistent in our ethical approaches. If we start by trying to get an understanding of what a human is, what a life is, and what a person is, then what we can look for is we have to start making some hard decisions, and amongst those hard decisions, hopefully we'll be consistent, all right? That's where I'm going with this. So let's work through a few things. We're always going to try to find some value we place on something, right? That's usually, even when you talk in terms of love, when you say you love something, it's some value you're placing on it. You tend to love things that you do not value, you tend not to love things you do not value, all right? But we're going to have to see how does that work then with this human person. So, my young biologist, what makes something alive? Don't think about human beings or anything like that. What makes something alive?
Well, there are like the 7 factors that make something alive.
Let me hear those 7 factors. Impress me.
Oh, wow. Okay. So
I'm sorry, just give me 1 or 2. That's perfect.
Okay, so it's like metabolism, and it's like growth and development.
Okay, growth, development, metabolism.
Reproduction.
Reproduction be part of it, absolutely. What else?
Like responding to stimulus.
Responding to stimuli, correct, right? How about like, what's the big fancy word for like the system of the internal system, everything's working right? Homeostasis, right? You would line all these things up. So most people don't think viruses are alive, correct? There's some out there to do, but we're not here to argue about that. Would we be confused about something that's alive as opposed to dead? or non-existent. Like, we wouldn't call vapor, like a smoke vapor, alive, right? No, we would not call something that's sedentary, like a rock, alive. So, if we really had to boil it down, right, so what you find out in your education that you learn as you move up from high school to bachelor's to graduate level degrees and then to your doctoral, they say you learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing, kind of that type of thing. You can laugh at that, that's a funny joke. The reality is that you'll see there's, up at the top level, there's a lot of like discussions and debates, right? So they might argue over what exactly, how do those criteria apply? But we don't generally aren't confused. We know when something is alive and when something is not alive. That's not, so when we talk about a living being, we're not like wondering, gee, I wonder what you mean by that. Especially in medical ethics, it's not something that should confuse us, right? So when we say, do we know whether or not something, the being is alive or not, that's not controversial, at least it should not be controversial. That's the only point. I'm not trying to be clever with all of this. It's just that you should work through things very systematically so that you don't kind of leave something vague and not quite, clear or such as you move on. What about human? What makes a living being human? What do you think? What makes a living being human? I'll tell you up front, you're not going to solve this, right? If you absolutely know for sure, you should write a paper and have it published. There was the Smithsonian Institute had a traveling display, I think it was called on being human, something like that. So, on one of my degrees is in philosophical anthropology, so I thought, well, I'm going to go. And it was interesting, like they struggle to determine exactly what is human. And by that I mean, like the Neanderthal. Is a Neanderthal not, like, is a human a Homo sapien? Is a Homo sapien entirely distinct from the Neanderthal? When I was at school, absolutely. Neanderthal was here, and then at some point it was no longer Neanderthal, and then we showed up. Well, a lot of what they're researching now is that there's a lot of intermixing for, hundreds of thousands of years, so who really knows? But interestingly enough, this anthropologist, he was obviously I don't know, the minimum of paleontologist, I'm not quite sure what his discipline was. But he was talking about this one dig that he just came from, and they found this fossil of a human person who had such severe injuries that they could not have cared for themselves. In other words, just by looking at the fossil record and the severity of the injury and the fact that it had healed and this person had lived a decade or so beyond this, that somebody was caring for this individual. I mean, this person could not have cared for himself. Impossible. And they were saying this is the oldest record we have of any, human, the hominid, of the species, helping another one. And when I saw him after the exhibit, I said, is there any other species that you know that is capable of that or has shown anything? He goes, none. That's a uniquely human thing, to care for the other person and nurture them through all of this. Maybe we'd say that's something that's human. But we're not really always sure, are we? Somebody might say it's rationality. But some of the apes seem to have a rationality. Have you ever heard the word risibility? You know what risibility means? Anybody? Reach in your lexicon? The ability to laugh, right? So if you're having a bad day, you go on to social media and you find a little baby laughing. It just makes your day, right? Why is that? Why do we laugh? So they used to think that was a unique human quality. But they're finding that some other, higher primates have that ability. But here's the thing. There's a saying that in the past, in the last hundreds of years, we were arrogant in thinking that we knew stuff that we didn't. In other words, we thought we knew more than we did. But they're saying today we have almost like a reverse arrogance. We're almost thinking that we don't know stuff that we really do. In other words, we can argue all day exactly what cuts off the human person. This is a construct, by the way, okay? So because it's a taxonomy that the human person, that ourselves, have developed. We've determined what makes something human and not human, and that line can move. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Will it change in the future? Who knows? Or that type of thing. But the reality is this. We don't really have a controversy about what is human and is not human. None of us go to a zoo and get confused. No. We know the animals behind the cages are not humans, and if we saw a human behind the cage, we would, hey, you know. So even though we might have some argument over what exactly classifies this taxonomy we call Homo sapiens, that's not generally something that we're confused about. So would you say that, is it fair enough to say, and you can disagree, is it fair enough to say that we don't have a misconception as to what is a human life? What do you think about that? If we kind of know what living is, we're pretty sure of that. Bless you. And we're pretty sure what human is. Do we have any issues with what is a human life? What do you think?
Well, I feel like, yeah, I feel like that's something that people think about more now, especially with like cloning technology and stuff. Because I feel like it's like what makes them, like, if you clone someone, would they be human? Or they clone
Okay.
it, like, is that a separate thing?
Okay, we'll talk about that in a second.
I think like, I don't know, I feel like there are always like exceptions to like, if you're on like a general rule of like, oh, like to be human is like, you like give the example like laughing or like caring, but there's also like,
If we were to build criteria, there's
Yeah.
exceptions. Okay, but would we be confused as to who or is not a human? I mean, can we pick anybody in the world that we typically consider human, but we're saying they're not human? Or somebody who's not typically considered human, but we're going to say they are human? What do you think about that?
Well, there's like the argument, obviously, of like when does life begin?
Okay.
So,
See, this is good. This is what we're getting. Now, this is not about abortion today, by the way, okay? But that's where we're going. So are we confused about when life begins?
like when people say like, is it, like they say like a fetus is different from a human being.
Yes. Okay. I'm glad now. But they're not taught. See, here's what I'm trying to, and it doesn't matter what your position is, right? Are we really confused about whether or not it's human? Or are we really confused about whether or not it's living? That doesn't mean that you're out of the woods. Maybe it just means that those aren't the two terms we're confused about. Wouldn't that help clear things up? I've already talked about the importance of terms. I mean, if somebody says we're not sure if it's human, it's not, remember, it's not enough to say what a thing is not. What is it? Well, it's going to be a human. What is it? Yeah, I mean, what is it now, right? Well, it's not living. Is it dead? No. Is it not alive? Does it have any of those characteristics that you shared? Okay. So there's a third term. All right. But before we get there, I want to talk about something else. What's the DNA comparison between humans and chimpanzees? Anybody know? What's the DNA comparison? Yeah.
Is it like 98 or 99?
Yeah, leave 99, right? Even somebody in section 4 said it's a little bit above that. What do you think that means? The chimpanzee and the human person shares 99% of the same DNA. Let me ask you this. Don't answer for yourself. Answer for somebody who maybe is a little more ignorant. And if you were having a conversation on the street, what do you think that would mean to them? If you try to say, hey, we share 99% of the DNA with a chimpanzee, what do you think they might be thinking you're trying to argue? What do you think?
Well, they think they're trying to argue that we're like very similar and like basically 99% the same as a chimpanzee.
They would, right? Because in the back of some people's mind, they hear the DNA sequencing, and they're thinking, is that me and you? In other words, if somebody were to do the 23andMe, is that you? You know? Well, that's interesting. But, so we share this DNA lineage, there's no doubt of that. And you guys know enough about the phenotypes and everything else that there's the structural changes in that 1% are tens of thousands, right? Like, in other words, we're not the sum, so we have to like almost push that aside. Maybe DNA helps us understand humans are, but it's not gonna tell us a lot, right? Because we're not 99% like chimpanzees. We share 99% of the DNA, but we're not 99% like them. I mean, a kindergarten will tell the difference between the two. So anybody who really struggles with what makes a thing human and not human, ask a kindergarten. They'll tell you, human, chimpanzee, right? This is the thing. Did you ever think of this? That 1% difference, because I've had people argue this to me, right? That this is how similar we are. In other words, so that they should then have almost the rights and forthwith everything the human person has. But you know that 1% difference within that is all of civilization. Think about it. Pyramids, Sebastian Bach, Led Zeppelin, guy from Monty Python that just passed away, the poor soul, you know. All the greatest books that have ever written, this university, cars, space travel, there's something that's pretty important there. Whatever those differences are, you're not going to boil them down to say, well, in our civilization and experiences, we're that close. It's still remarkable, right? It's just that we have to understand exactly what that means, that type of thing. So these two terms are very important, life and human. I'm trying to at least make the basic case that they're not controversial terms. And we shouldn't talk about when life begins. We kind of know that. We should talk about whether or not it's a human. We kind of know that. But that doesn't mean that we're all in agreement and we're out of the woods. The next thing is going to be a little bit more important. Person. What makes a human life a person? That's the difference, right? That's where all the argument goes. And again, this is not about abortion. What we're going to do is we're going to try to determine how do we come up with a concept of personhood. And then how are we going to be consistent throughout our medical ethics? We're going to apply this on all ends. So what I have is I have a series of 20 questions I'm going to put up one at a time. You can raise your hand and talk about it. And I want you in the back of your mind, if I were to do this again, I think, do you ever do like the text to polling? I was going to do that. I just didn't have time to set it up so we could see where everybody sits on all of this. But whatever criteria that you choose, like when you say yay or nay to these 20 questions, start to keep it in the back of your head because that's the criteria that you're developing. And once you develop that criteria, then we're going to try to apply it. Not here, but you should try to apply that and say, where did that sit me on my ethical issues now, right? I might not sit where exactly I was hoping I would. All right. It's unlikely this is controversial, right? We would call these things living. We would not probably call them human. But we certainly would not think that any of us, at any stage, were either a sperm or an ovum separately, okay? Fine. What about a 2-week-old fetus? Now, when I say it was that you, I'm talking about you as the person, not just the body, right? Not just the mind, you as the whole person. When you say, I'll be back, I'm on my way, whatever that I is, that's what we're talking about, okay? Were you ever a 2-week-old fetus? Were you ever a 6-month-old fetus? There's a distinction there in development, right? So we're at the point now where, you know, pain can be felt. Not 20 weeks would that be? We're at viability, okay? That type of thing. I'm guessing everybody's going to say that we are all 2-month-old infants, okay? But here's something interesting. What if you determine personhood, and I'm jumping ahead, but what if you determine personhood on self-awareness? Like, until you are self-aware of your own existence, you're not a person. If you think that, like if there's a level of consciousness that you think is what the person is, then you are not a person at 2 months old. Because that really doesn't develop in about 5 or 6 months. There's an ethicist from Princeton, Peter Singer. He's very famous. If you went into YouTube or You might even catch them if you just happen to be flipping around the channel sometime on some show where they're having discussions. He doesn't believe that until a person is self-aware that they are persons. Fine, they're human, they're living, but they're not persons. So he has no issue with terminating a 3-month-old.
Like, could you argue that like personhood could be like taken away then? Or like, cause like.
You could lose it.
Yeah, can you lose it?
Oh, sure. But see, he's a very good philosopher and he's very consistent, all right? So the reason why this is not about abortion and why I'm not here arguing legal issues of personhood, because that's not the domain. I could share with you that, you know legally you're a person upon birth. I mean, once the head is outside the vaginal cavity, we have personhood, at least that's how the court's defining it now. I'm unaware of any philosopher that thinks that makes any sense. But we're not talking about that. We're not here to argue about that. In other words, so when does personhood begin? At what level? And this is not, we're not doing this dogmatically. This is, a philosophical background in this ethics. So we can't just call in some dogmatic revelation and say this is what it is. You can respect that, but we're not arguing that here. So Peter Singer would say until a person is self-aware, self-conscious, they don't have the quality of personhood. And that shocks some people. But he's very consistent, and he probably would wrap you up in an argument. Well, what do you think it is? And once you start saying stuff, he'll probably just twist you around, and at some point, see, what we're going to go with this too is like he's an animal rights advocate. So sometimes we might come up with criteria for persons that extend to other, animals. And he says, well, yeah, it's fine. So there could be some animals that have a particular level of personhood that a 2-month-old, he'll say yes. And he'll make a very rational argument, okay? All I want you to do is know that this is part of the discussion. It's not as straightforward as everybody particularly thinks. And if we are going in ethics, try to determine, the values that we place on its own personhood. It should not be on living and human. Those things should not be controversial topics. Even if people say human life and mean this, fine, correct them. We're talking about personhood, right? Because then you at least have a conversation. Okay, if you said you were a 2-month-old, I'm sure you thought you were a 10-year-old and a 17-year-old. But how about this? What if there was some tragic brain injury and you fell into a permanent vegetative state? You've lost your consciousness at this point, right? And he would say, that's right. You don't have a person there anymore. Although he probably would start to say there's a collective life that has a value, there were collective memories, and he would make some sort of argument that that's still a little more of a permanent thing that deserves respect rather than a 2-month-old that does not have the history there, right? That type of thing. But have you ever known somebody in a permanent vegetative state? We use colloquial terms like, well, that's not Uncle Joe anymore. We talk like this, right? That's not really him. It's no longer there. Now, that type of situation is not the place to work out the metaphysics. Well, then, what is that? You know what I mean? From an ethical standpoint, we can't just keep saying what something is not. What is that? And if it's not Uncle Joe, where did he go? That type of thing, all right? How about if he had a personality-altering injury? I'm talking absolute permanent. Anybody know anybody like that? Somebody in the last class had a sibling. Go to nursing homes? Anybody here spend time in nursing homes? You really should. Everybody who says they want to live to be 98 because they saw some lady who was that old doing parallel bars on YouTube, go to a nursing home and find out what 85 really looks like on a regular basis, right? You tend to, how do you want to say, lose your inhibitions, right? So did anybody here spend time working in nursing homes or go to visit and such, all right? I'm not trying to freak you out, but you would think that at some point they no longer consider themselves like sexual beings, but they never lose that. They're like teenagers, right? And my wife, who when they work there, they tease them, the workers, and they say, I know you're trying to be good people, and you want to go through life not swearing and not saying all the things that you don't want to say, but if you don't get it out now, it's going to come out once the inhibitions roll down. So then, all of a sudden, Grandma, where'd you get a mouth like a sailor, that type of thing. Well, who is this person? Is it the same person? Was the brain injury, did that make them somebody else? We might even talk and say it's not the same person anymore. We'll see how we're using that word. We don't stop saying it's a human, do we? We don't stop saying it's alive. We say it's not the same person. But that makes us ask another question. Well then, what happened to the person that it was? And what is this personhood? Do you kind of get it? This is not as straightforward as somebody might initially think. How about if we put you on a heart and lung machine? That's it. Now we probably would be okay with calling that a person because we tend, at least in the West, to place personhood tied into rationality. And this person would have all their wits about them, let's say that, right? But nonetheless, they're on a heart and lung machine that's at least keeping them going, per se. We're just making up scenarios. What about 30 seconds after death? Now we know death is not an instant, right? Has anybody, and I always hate asking questions, they sound morbid. Have you been with somebody who's passed? Right? It's a process. But there is a point where they do call it, right? For probably legal reasons. And we have to have moral certainty. That's all you can really do. I mean, you know, once the vital signs are gone, they check the, artery. Is that still you? If it wasn't, where did you go? Right? That type of thing. Now see, a lot of different religions have dogmatic ways to handle this, but we can't do that. We've got to figure out like what happens here. They're no longer there. But see, at this point, we might even talk about human in the past tense, we would no longer talk about living, right? So whatever confusion we had about what it means to be alive, we know that this is not alive. We've declared this individual dead, and not on some arbitrary thing either. Paraplegic, we probably would not think that alters who we are as much. Same thing if it was a quadriplegic. But what if we could take your head and brain and keep you alive artificially? There's all kinds of science fiction with this, right? And there's even rumors of the brain or the head transplant. What would happen? Is our brain, sometimes we use the word brain and mind as synonyms, but are they synonyms? The brain's an organ. Is the mind? Now, if you're atheist, then it'd be an immaterial aspect, and you probably would see those two. But if you're not an atheist, or just an atheist who has some sort of sense of, spiritual aspect, they would say, well, I think there's something more than the brain. So if we were to just capture the brain, what would we have? I was at the bedside of my cousin, who was an extraordinary stockbroker. I remember his wife saying, "If we just capture that brain." I know better than bring stuff up at instances like that, but you can almost imagine what I was thinking. What would that do? How would we know? Is that where they are? If we split the brain in half, on Tuesday, we're going to walk through a lot of scenarios like this, right? None of this stuff is novel. I'm not giving you anything that I thought of on my own. Philosophers have been delving into this for quite some time, and there's thought experiment after thought experiment after what happens if you take, we'll look at one called The Prince and the Cobbler. If you switch the brains of the prince and the cobbler and the brain, which one's the prince? That type of thing. So we'll get into that. How about if little by little your organs are replaced over time? How long does it take all your cells in the body to renew? Anybody know how long?
7 years.
7 years. Do you change every 7 years? There's an old, and by the way, that would be a very old understanding of a puzzle, if you want to call it that, at least some stuff, a philosophical conundrum. There was the ship of Theseus, I think. Anybody ever hear of that? The Greeks said if you build a ship, and then over the course of so many years, you consistently replace the wood and the nails, so that over the course of X amount of years, every single nail and piece of wood in that ship has been replaced and is not original? Is it the same ship? Most people are gonna say yes, but then you gotta build up some, theory of continuity. And then you're gonna have to build up some theory of what exactly are we talking, what has to be continuous? Do you have to have, what if I did half the ship at one time? Does it have to be so much? That type of thing, okay? This is not unlike that previous question. And when this says, would you survive the replacement, it doesn't mean would we have a living human at the other side. It means whoever you were. If we did that with you, would that still be you? Or who is that now? That type of thing. I mean, these are the questions of science fiction. I mean, if anybody watched Twilight Zone, Star Trek, I'm thinking of how many episodes are based on this type of, what I call it, philosophical conundrum. This is not unlike the permanent vegetative state. Tragically, somebody has Alzheimer's, and they get to the point where they really don't no longer know who they are. Who are they? That's interesting, isn't it? Anybody here hoping to work with geriatrics? It's challenging. And even, like I was talking once to a speech pathologist who used to work with stroke victims. And he said, it's just heartbreaking. He said, because you will work for a year or two to get them back to where they feel comfortable communicating, and then they suffer another stroke, and you're back, with, I'm not being demeaning, you're back with a toddler, and then you're doing it all over again. And then, the old idea always was in the past with people that were suffering from some sort of dementia was to correct them. Well, today the idea is you just go with it. Whatever they're doing, just go with it. But that can be really difficult. A friend of mine, her father had dementia, and she was his sole, caregiver. And she'd come in, and I'd say, how are you doing? She's like, oh. She goes, he's hit on me today. And I explained to him, as best I could, that I'm his daughter. I said, what did he say? All he said was, so you're saying there's no chance. How do you continue giving care to that? I mean, that's a struggle. So if we're going to put dignity onto that person based on their personhood, who is that? You know what I mean? Or is it just because somebody might argue, but they've had a collective life? I mean, it's different than a 2-month-old, right? A 2-month-old hasn't had all that experience, and what have they missed? But this person, even though they aren't there to experience and enjoy it, it's still there. But they don't know that, So we're going to have to try to figure out, well, then, what are we talking about? What is this personhood? What if we just replaced all your moral values? If we had some way to flip the switch, right? And this is, grandma using dirty words here.
I was actually thinking something like that with the question about Alzheimer's. Like, what if when you were like a teenager, you were like really bad, but then some people like have those transformations and they like, in a sense, become like a whole different person, even though like physically you're exactly the same, but mentally.
It's interesting. You see how, and I'm not calling you out, because I would say it the same way, but you see how we use the word person? They're a new person, but then where'd that other one go, and who was it? Is it just tied into personality, or is there something deeper? I can tell you what I think, but it doesn't work that way, right? We have to work this stuff out ourselves. So I'm just trying to put in front of you all the various things to consider. What if we made a duplicate brain, and we were able to duplicate all your memories, your psychology, and everything, and we took it out of you and put it on the person? Is that now you? And if it is, where did you go? Okay. Now, usually you work out scenarios like this to try to test the waters, like where are the limits and where do I understand person? But I'm really trying to drive a deeper question. This is where the argument lies. I don't care what people argue about what is living and what is human. That should not be really part of our discussion. Somebody is trying to convince you by, proving to you that it's a human life, they've only proved to you what biology can tell you. We're outside of biology now, okay? I mean, ethics is applied philosophy. So, once you get into this realm, we have to start making rational arguments. We're not going to empirically. And you see why I tried to say inductive reasoning has its purposes, but this is much more important to us than what is human and what is living. empirical studies can help us determine that, but we would put more emphasis on this than we would that. That's important, don't get me wrong, but once we have that, this becomes the important questions for us. And again, if I just moved in another body and it continues to function in another body, where did you go, right? It's just an extension on that question. So these are things to think about, and you know, whatever the answers were to you in your mind, you've already started to develop some criteria for personhood. So what I want to do now is I want to give you just 3 like broad ways to divide this up. And it's only 3, there's probably more. And then we're going to leave something more specific for next Tuesday. Which, did anybody here take the Philosophy 1000 yet? The reality one? Okay, when you went over selfhood, did they cover like theories of persons and such? And okay, I taught last semester and went into it heavy, right? And what constitutes like a type of nature and an artifact or a construct? You know, what parts do we make up and what parts can we not make up, right? That type of thing. We're going to do that on Tuesday. So those are the 3 terms. The first way that some people do it is this called capacity X. In other words, I will call a human life a person if it has this capacity. What do you think would be candidates for that? What do you think? If you had to make the call, you're God, determine who is or is not persons by what capacities they have, what would you start choosing? What do you think? What do you think? I'll start you out, rationality. You're probably going to figure there has to be some sort of reason that they can use. We'd have to start asking questions. What do we do when that reason's not developed, right?
I was gonna say empathy, but
Yeah.
then to think there are some people like with mental health, like differences that aren't able to feel.
Yeah, you want to freak yourself out, go and Google percentage of sociopaths.
Yeah, but there's still.
Statistically, we got a few here. In other words, it's more than we think, right? But you're right, it's okay. So empathy would be something, but even if we talk about just a general sense of compassion and such, you know, we're not going to raise it to that level and such. What else?
Consciousness.
Consciousness, okay. That would leave out, you know, 4-month-olds and Uncle Joe that's in a permanent vegetative state, but that's okay. You got to come up with some criteria. Maybe capacity for language, right?
Emotion.
Emotions, right? Something, you know. And probably whatever you guys were talking about with just living too. Yeah, sentience and such, something. Okay, let's just leave it there. We're not here to figure it all out. I'm just trying to let you know that this is one way to go about it. In other words, if we're going to try to determine what constitutes a person, you know, by capacity, we'll have to start to figure out what those capacities are. What you're probably going to find out is that, and this is what Peter Singer kind of puts together, is that some of those capacities bleed over into other species, which is why he would be an animal rights advocate, right? Because he would see the sense of feeling pain. Maybe there is a level of at least compassion that you would see between animals. You know, it's difficult for us to say. I mean, we're conditioned by Disney. I don't mean that to be silly, right? But we're conditioned by really reading into all these animals that probably 200 years ago they didn't see them animated. So it's hard for us to not see, you know, a lot of animals that are at least higher up as human-like. Let's say it that way. The other one is by potentiality. So even if it doesn't have a particular capacity, at least it has the potentiality for that, right? So now our 2-month-old will be perfectly fine because it potentially will be sentient. It'll potentially at least be able to reason through things. But we still have a little bit of a problem that what happens if he loses that potentiality. And oftentimes, when I say like the pedestrian argument, like we're just having discussions out in the street somewhere, these types of potentialities are known as like a future happening, okay? Like it's possible sometime in the future. I'm gonna show you real briefly how there's another way you have to look at that, all right? But anyway, I'm not here to iron all this out. I'm just trying to give you like some broad categories. Now, we're in an Augustinian Institute, okay? So if you have a religious belief, even if it is dogmatic, it doesn't mean it's irrational, okay? It just means it's not based on reason per se, that it was based on something other than reason, but it's still rational. So you hear the term nature a lot, like human nature. But what does that mean? See, we could talk about natural kinds, or we could talk about conventional things. Like Homo sapien might be a conventional taxonomy. Nothing fell out of the sky. Science didn't discover Homo sapien. They had to say, based on criteria, and yeah, you can go through all the phenotypes, we could talk about all the genetic, all that stuff, yeah, but fine. But it's still something the human being itself created as a taxonomy. It didn't fall out here. So we live in a postmodern age where the nature of something is sort of denied. In other words, even in types of existentialism per se, you'll see that the essence, what a thing is, flows, actually, the nature comes from that, or is determined by your existence, let's put it that way. So we can determine who we are. There's not particularly a nature to that thing. But if there is a nature to that thing, what is that nature? So this is a way to do it. And this would be, at least, not just purely Augustinian, but certainly Roman Catholic. Roman Catholic uses philosophy quite a bit in ethics. You cannot study philosophy without delving into Catholic philosophers. It's impossible. It's the history of philosophy. So even there's a term, like what makes me not you and you not me? In philosophy, that's known as individuation. How can we all be humans, right? The universal human, but yet we're all individuals. Well, that has been a topic of philosophy from the beginning. And I remember when I was taking one course just in medieval individuation, the book was this thick. It looked like one of those Norton Anthology of Literature books, those onion-thin papers, but it was only on what they thought in the medieval period on, different views of individuation. What makes us us. But this is the basic underlying. If I had to boil it all down, a nature would have to be something that's stable. It's always there. It's not something that you can construct, and it's something that you inherit. Because the minute that you inherit or you construct it, it's not natural, it's a construct. Does that sound reasonable enough? Again, it doesn't matter if you agree with it, it's whether you understand it. So actual and potential have different meanings than we use them in normal speech. Actual means the perfection of the thing. Potential means that the actuality is possible within it. So if I were to hold an acorn in my hand, I would say, this acorn is its actuality. And I might say its nature is oak. And you might say, how do you know that? Because it's not going to become a pineapple. Its potentiality is to be a sapling. But that's not its, somebody might say, well, that's only a possible future. No, it's its only future. It's true that it couldn't happen. It's like your eye, right? Even in utero, as your eye develops, your eye, once it starts to develop, is not going to hear. It only has one future, and the future is to see. Not all eyes see, but that's because something got damaged. The nature's still there. So once I have a sapling, I would say it's still an oak. But now, if an acorn or a sapling, it actualizes a sapling, but it still has a potentiality to be a tree. When it's finally a potentiality has been reached and it's actualized in the tree, it's still an oak. So whether it was an acorn, a sapling, or the full-blown tree, it has always been an oak. Because we have determined there's something within that nature that's oak. They would then apply that to the human person. Whether it's the fetus, the toddler, the same thing. So for somebody to say that it's a, when you hear, and again, this has nothing to do with your particular stance. No matter if you are, me in slogans, even if you're pro-life or pro-choice, this only going to help you sharpen your argument. When somebody says it's a future human being, that doesn't work. Whoa, what is it now? And what do you mean future human being? It's not going to be a giraffe. It is this. Really, what we're trying to determine is when does this thing become person? Because even personhood, not founded directly within that nature, we have to determine what else on that, right? So these three things are going to give us something different, right? If we start to talk about what is a capacity, then we're going to have to start arguing about what is the qualities of that capacity, and what happens on the other end of the spectrum. I mean, if we're going to say consciousness is capacity, and a 3-month-old doesn't have it, fine, but Uncle Joe, who suffers from Alzheimer's, might have lost it too. And then somebody might bring something else in. Well, but I also think there's that collective memory, and somehow that has to count for something. Okay, but how much of it counts? What if you were only 9? Was from 2-month-old to 9 enough? Or do you have to, I mean, this is where it happens. So here's my point with all of this. We'll get to it in a sec. If we're going to say that sometimes our criteria or our potentialities, or even if we're trying to form a nature, what happens if we have a human life that's not a person? Is that possible? What do you think about that? Is it possible to have a non-person human? What do you think? Bless you. Because this is where, I would say the rubber hits the road. Is there such a thing as a non-human person? You guys are either too nice or too tired. Now, when you declare that something is not human, the dehumanization of something, right, it's going to result in some genocide. Look at what just happened in Rwanda with the Tutsis, right? So if one's declared a cockroach by another leader, they're not even considered to be human, which means that they have no care given. It's like the spider in the next broom. It doesn't matter if you're a step on it, right? That type of thing. But we're not out of the woods even if we stick and say, well, we know it's human. Because if we're going to start making arguments that there are some non-human, non-person humans, then when we depersonalize something, it subjugates to another. There's no other way to say it. Slavery is the easiest example. As a matter of fact, they say, I was reading one of the UN statistics, they said there's a little over 40 million slaves alive today. Think of that. That's over 3 to 4 times the entire amount of slaves that were part of the transatlantic slave over 5 centuries. They got, in terms, right? So what counts as a slave? It could be somebody who's forced labor, forced sex trade, forced marriage. They count all those as slaves. But you can't subjugate somebody over another unless you depersonalize them, right? So maybe in medical ethics, this issue doesn't come up so far, but this is the extent of it, right? This is the same reason why we try to figure out what does it mean to be a person. And if, like Peter Singer says, you can't just equate person with humans. Okay, but see, he's doing that, and it leaves the 3-month-old and the 78-year-old Alzheimer's Uncle Joe as non-persons. But his criteria would include some animals, which is why he would be an advocate for animal rights, right? Which, I'm trying to give my opinion on too much, but I'm going to give you my opinion here so you can think about this. When we talk about animal rights, that's another one of those, it's almost slogan-like. We don't know what that means, right? I mean, they don't have rights like to not be owned. We don't say somebody owns that dog. Of course somebody owns that dog, you need to take care of it, right? That type of thing. And we live, it's different now, like even when I was younger, nobody kept big dogs in the house. I know today that's just like, you can't even imagine that. But that was just, nobody would have. I mean, they were large animals, kept them outside. And I think a lot of farmers today would still think that. So the idea that, we've come a bit away on that, and especially like Europe, particularly Britain, the United States, per se. But he would extend rights to some of these animals, particularly like the chimpanzees, bonobos. The reason why I question how far they push that is they never hold them responsible for anything. You know what I mean? If a chimpanzee did something they shouldn't, is there a trial? Do they say, do they hold it gullible or responsible for whatever it did? I'm not sure. Just something for you to think about. But before we end, here's what I want to put out there. when we start to determine this, because whatever you determine qualifies as a person, you're gonna apply that in your ethical life. At the beginning and the end, and all in between. And this is something for you to think about, because this is the problem I have. Who determines this? Who's the group that's gonna make the call? It's always gonna be somebody with power and prestige. Which, you know, capital includes money, but it's not just that. And nobody wants money for its own sake. Everybody wants money so it gives them power. Same thing with prestige, it just gives you power. And here's something to ask. Do you think a group in power is ever going to consider their own kind to be non-persons? No. It's always going to be the other guy. And if you know anything, I teach social justice issues too. It's not no surprise. It's always the poor and the powerless that get screwed. I don't care what it is. They come out with the best laid plan for health care, the best laid plan for this, and they're still going to find some way to screw the poor and the powerless. Well, they're the ones that are going to go down in this. You know. So then what do? Do we attribute personhood across the board? Well, you could, but that's going to have its own limits then too. Because now you're back to conception to natural death, right? Those are the things to work out. So all I was trying to do was unsettle you a little bit, right? You guys know the allegory of the cave. When you get released from the cave and you realize what's going on, and a lot of this is shadows, and you're using your senses, and you're not out yet, it'll be a little disturbing, but that's what education's supposed to do. So on Tuesday, we'll look at a bunch of other theories on personhood and such, and at least you can make some informed decisions. But did this at least give you, was this more than you thought probably coming in maybe? Okay. Do you guys have any questions? You're so quiet.